Building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I am Alex Edmonds, also known as SupremeRumHam on the internet, and this is the Building an Indie Business podcast. Okay, so today we're going to discuss how to find people to interview for your podcast. There's 5 ways. You can start with friends, use the open podcast forum, places where guests will advertise themselves, cold email or DM, in person, and an open call. So I'm going to be discussing like the benefits of each issue or each idea and the problems that you might run into with each of them. Okay, so let's get started. Start with friends. What's great about starting with friends is you get the feel of interviewing without the pressure of interviewing someone. So, like my interview with Brendan, it didn't really feel like an interview. It just felt like him and I were talking and there was a recording on, or it was being recorded, right? Okay, so with your friends, they are less likely to say no than a stranger because you know them, you've built a relationship with them. Yeah. Your friends might approach you if they have something to promote. So with my interview with Brennan, I didn't approach him to interview him. He said on open podcast, he was like, "Hey, can someone interview me?" And I was like, "Yeah," because I was right in the middle of writing an article about interviewing, but I didn't have an experience, and I wanted the experience of interviewing to write the article. So yeah, he approached me, and that was great. So if your friends know you have a podcast, they might ask you, "Hey, can I come on and talk about my blog?" So yeah, that's a great thing. Problems. You might run into some problems. One of them is that your group of friends might not have an incentive to be a guest or nothing to promote. So let's say you have a true crime podcast. Your friend with a blog about, finance might not have an incentive to come on your true crime podcast. Okay. The final problem that you might run into is scheduling. If you want to do the interview in person, it might be difficult to meet up and record in person. But there's always, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh yeah, remote interviews. So that's something. Okay. The open podcast forum. So on the open podcast forum, there is a section of the forum where people can say, "Hey, I'm looking for a guest. I'm looking to be a guest." I think it's called the host-guest exchange. And the benefits of the part of open podcast is that you can find people with similar incentives. So you can find someone that wants to be a guest, and you don't have to sell them on the idea of being a guest, and you have a pool of people that want to be a guest as a host. So that's cool. And then when you post on the forum, that post gets promoted. You get more eyeballs for free. So you get your post in the open podcast newsletter, and the curator of the open podcast Twitter account, I don't know who that is, but he will tweet out your post to get more eyeballs on it. And that's things that you don't have to do. And you might run into someone someone might not be in your network, but in the open podcast network, and they might be willing to be a podcast guest. So open podcast has access to people that you don't have access to. And that is a good thing because it casts a wider net. Okay. Also, posting on the forum is an automated process. it's one and done. If you were to do like something else, if you have to look for when you're looking for friends, or you're posting on social media or DMing someone, you have to do that multiple times. With the open podcast forum, you post it once, and every new member is an opportunity for a guest to be on your podcast. So that's cool. It's a recurring resource as well, because as people grow into the forum, that's more opportunities. And yeah, with that, it's different from like a social media post, because if you post on Twitter, that post only has like a life cycle of maybe 24 hours, whereas the open podcast forum post will be for many weeks or maybe even months, where you might get people talking to you about your forum post. So I think that's great. Yeah. I don't think there are any problems with the open... one problem with the open podcast forum is that it's a small community, right? So it might take some time before you find someone to be a member of... be a guest on your podcast. Okay. Yeah. So places where guests advertise themselves. So there are places that aren't the open podcast forum, like dedicated websites to looking for podcast guests. You could find these websites. I only know of one, and it got taken down. So the benefits of this is that you immediately know that these people are willing to be interviewed. You don't have to convince them, right? So another thing is you might find multiple people to interview, which is great. And these people, they're advertising themselves, right, to be a guest on a podcast. So that means they'll leave their information to be contacted about being a guest. So you don't have to look for their information. It's right there. And this is different from other sources of contacting people where you have to look for it. Like if you, I'll talk about that soon. Okay. The problems with having guests that are looking in places where the guests advertise themselves is these people might lose interest in being a guest. So let's say I post on one of these websites, and it's 4 months later. I post to promote my book, and I'm just done with the book, right? Or promoting it at least. At 4 months later, let's say, and I've moved on to writing the second book, and I'm done with the first book. I don't want to go to promote the first book because I'm done with it. I'm on to the second one. So I have no interest in being a guest. I just forgot to take down the post. You could run into that situation. The last problem that I thought of for advertising places is interviewing a stranger might be awkward. So when you interview friends or people you know, what might happen is that you have a rapport with them, so it's not awkward. I already said that, but yeah. So with interviewing a stranger, there's no rapport. So that interview might get awkward because you don't have stories about hanging out with each other, which is what I used for my interview with Brennan, right? So, yeah. All right. So another option is to cold email or cold DM them. And this is how I would get Warren Buffett on my podcast. So let's say I want Warren Buffett on my podcast. I already said this. So I could look... Oh, no, never mind. Wait, yeah. So I could look for his Twitter account or his email, but does this go somewhere? No. Okay. So if I want to find someone to be a guest on the podcast, I would look for people who are preparing to release something, preparing to release a book, preparing to launch their product. And I would look for people who are in the like pre-launch phase, pre-order phase, because that means they're preparing to launch, right? And by the time the episode comes out, maybe they may have launched, right? So let's say I know someone who's launching a book, and I what's the word I was looking for? Sorry. I interview them the next week. I interview them next week, and that episode might come out in a month. So by the time their book comes out, it'll be ready for people to buy it right away. So that way, people aren't waiting around to like buy the book, or my listeners aren't waiting around to buy the book. Yeah. And then when someone is preparing to release something, they're easy to do research on because they either have done more interviews and you could talk to them about that, or you could read their content and then talk to them about their content. They might even look to give you like a free book, and you could read it and come up with questions from the book, right? They're looking for stuff to promote as well. Or they're looking to promote their stuff and get more people to buy it. So when you cold email them or cold DM them, they'll be more willing to go on the podcast. And when you want to, what's the word I'm looking for? To get them on your podcast, this is how I would get Warren Buffett on the podcast. So when you contact them, you want to contact them with an exact agenda. I want to have you on the podcast to talk about your book. So if I was trying to get Warren Buffett on the podcast, I would say, Dear Mr. Buffett, I would like you to come on the Building an Indie Business podcast to talk about your real investment strategy, because you always talk about how you do the dividends trading, but there's something else that you do, and I want to know what it is. I wouldn't say that angrily, but yes, that's what I want to know. And so I would say that, and then you need to be unique, right? You can't just say, I love your book. So you need to say, yeah, I want to talk about your investment strategy, not like, oh, you have an interesting investment strategy, and I would like to hear about it, because they can just point you to another interview, right? They don't have to go on your podcast. So you need to be unique, and you need to be unique. Being unique and being exact will get you a better chance of having like more famous guests, because famous people are very busy. So they're not gonna respond to like generic DMs where you just start out with hey, I mean, I don't know. I'm not famous, so I don't know for sure. All right. So problems with this DM email thing. You might not get responses. If I cold DM Warren Buffett, he might not respond because he gets hundreds of emails, and some 20-something and on a wanting him to be on his podcast. It's not a priority. He doesn't get a lot of benefit from it, so he might not respond at all. And then with this strategy, you need to contact dozens of people, because Warren Buffett might not respond. So I need a backup plan. I need to contact Ray Dalio, or what's that other guy? Howard Marks, or the other guys. I don't know. I can't remember any investment people anymore. Okay. And then it might be hard to get the personal information of the people that you want to contact. So I don't know how to get in touch with Warren Buffett. I don't know if he's on Twitter, to be honest. He probably isn't, because he had this presentation, right, and it had no styling, which I thought was so cool. Anyways, yeah, so I don't know how to get his email. I don't even know if he checks his email, right? So I have to work really hard to even talk to him. Yeah. Okay. So the next method is in person. And the way you would do in person is meetups, conferences, co-working spaces. And why you want to do these 3 places is because all of those places you can find people that are looking to promote stuff, their work, not stuff. I don't like using the word stuff, but I constantly use it. Okay, so the benefits of doing the in-person promoting or networking, that's a good word, is that when you go to a meetup and you go to a conference, when you go to a co-working space, these are all people that are out of your network. At a meetup, you're looking to meet new people and connect with them. So it's not going to be like people you went to high school with. You might run into people you went to high school with, but there's someone new for you in that space, right? Same thing with conferences. Same thing with co-working spaces. Co-working spaces, well, I think that would work really well. I've never even been in a co-working space, but those are people building their own stuff sometimes, and so they want the free promotion, so they will go on your podcast. Yeah. Another benefit is when you do an in-person interview or look for people in person, they're local, so you can meet up with them. I guess they could come to your office and record the podcast. And when you need someone local, like when you need a new job, right, you could talk to them because they're now in your network and they might know of someone who's hiring. Yeah. Okay. So the problems with doing or looking in person is you need equipment. So you're doing a in-person interview. So right now I just have a mic because it's myself. But if I needed to interview someone in person, I would need a mixer and another mic. That's more equipment that I would have to carry around. It adds extra, I don't know, extra responsibility. Yeah, okay. And then you do all these places, right? You go to the meetups, you go to the conferences, you go to the co-working spaces, you talk to people. That's a hassle, right? And then you might not even find someone that fits your podcast audience, right? So, let's say you have a finance podcast and you only meet people who are into, that's the word I was looking for, true crime. And they don't really fit your audience, right? And those are the only people you run into. So now you have no one that fits your audience. So you did all that and you got nothing. Yeah. The final problem that I find with in-person, looking for people in person, is it's not scalable, right? There's not as many, especially now, there's not as many meetups, there's not conferences. I don't know if co-working spaces are open. That just made this podcast episode not evergreen, but okay. Yeah. Open call. And so what I mean by open call is you tell people, you're like, hey, I'm looking for podcast guests. You say it on your podcast, you say it on social media. It's an open call for telling people to hit you up, to be on the podcast. So, yeah, by doing this, you're letting them come to you. So, if I said on open podcast, or on this podcast, the very first thing I said was, hey, I'm looking for guests. Some people might say, hey, I want to be on your podcast. And that's work that I don't have to do. Or it's not much work because they're coming to me, which is great. Email list. Let's say you have an email list, which if you listen to this and you have a podcast, you should have an email list because I always talk about it, right? So you can add something to your email list. Be like, hey, I'm looking for podcast guests. Put it at the top. Put it in bold. And they might reply because it's so easy. All you have to do is hit the reply button and then type, hey, I would like to be on your podcast. Then hit reply. And it's done. Okay. Yeah, this is what happened with Brennan. I already talked about this, but he asked me to interview him, which is great. And then I needed the experience. Yeah, so that's cool. And then another benefit, which I like, is that you get to find out who's listening to your podcast. So imagine if I said, hey, come on my podcast because I want to interview people. And Warren Buffett hits me up and he's like, hey, I'd like to be on your podcast. I get to find out that Warren Buffett is a listener of BAIB. That's fantastic. And then I'd ask him, I'd be like, hey, why do you listen to my podcast? And then I find out, and I'm able to use that information to get more billionaires to listen to my podcast. There's no downside of doing that, right? So that's cool. And then I feel like you bond with anyone who you've been on a podcast with because I have a great relationship with Brennan. Shout out. What's up? He did the new cover of the podcast. Yeah. So, and I didn't really know him until I interviewed him. And we've been in contact ever since. I talk to him probably at least once a week through video chat. And yeah, I feel like because I interviewed him, we have that relationship. So that's great. And then I interviewed Ross and I talk to him all the time. So yeah, those are the two people I interviewed and I have a good relationship with them. I feel like, yeah. So that's great. The problem with the open call is that people might be scared to reach out to you because they think, he's a busy guy, right? He might not see my DM or my email or my reply because he's getting hundreds of requests. And you know what? I'm not. So if you want me to interview you, reach out. It'll be cool. The next problem is you're only limited to people in your network. So when you do the open call, you're only limited to the people that listen to your podcast or the people that see it on social media, right? Because it's you reaching out and there's no one else helping you promote it. You might, like Brennan might retweet it when I say, hey, I'm looking for guests, and his network will then see it. But, odds are it's only going to be my network or maybe a little bit out. You know what I mean? So that's a problem. It's just a recurring cycle of people in your network. And then you need to do this repeatedly. I can't just say on one podcast episode, hey, I'm looking for guests. I have to do it 3, 4, 5 times to get people to reach out to me. Okay. Thank you for listening. That's all I have. Have a nice day.